At exactly 6:47 a.m. on March 12, 1944, the world for Corporal James Jimmy Dalton was reduced to a singular, vibrating line of rusted metal. He was crouched in a muddy, freezing ditch outside Cassino, Italy, watching a 4-ton German armored scout car roll toward his position at a steady 15 miles per hour. He had no bazooka. He had no anti-tank mines. He didn't even have a single fragmentation grenade left in his kit. All he had was a length of rusted barbed wire wrapped around the handles of 2 standard-issue shovels. Every officer in the 34th Infantry Division had explicitly forbidden him from using this contraption. They called it a safety hazard. They called it a violation of the field manual. They threatened him with a court-martial. But in the next 90 seconds, that improvised tripwire would flip military doctrine on its head and save an entire company from certain annihilation. Imagine standing in that ditch. Your hands are numb, your boots are filled with icy slush, and a 20mm autocannon is pointed directly at your heart. Would you trust your life to a piece of scrap metal you found in a dump? Would you risk a prison sentence to save the men standing next to you? Jimmy Dalton wasn't supposed to be a hero. He was supposed to be a switchman. He grew up in the industrial shadow of Gary, Indiana, a place where the sky was perpetually bruised purple and orange by the fires of U.S. Steel. His father worked the blast furnaces 15-hour shifts in a world of molten iron and deafening noise. The paycheck barely covered the rent for 8 people in a 2-room shack. Jimmy, the middle child, learned the language of machines before he learned the language of books. He spent his afternoons at the rail yards, watching how thousands of tons of steel moved on thin rails. He learned which couplings failed, how a single loose pin could derail a 50-car train, and how to rig temporary fixes with wire and rope when the company refused to buy new parts. He learned that the official manual was written by men in offices, but the machines were kept running by men with dirty fingernails and creative minds. When he enlisted in January 1943, he thought the Army would be an extension of the rail yards, organized, logical, and efficient. He was wrong. By the time he reached the Liri Valley in Italy, he realized that the Army was a massive, slow-moving beast that often choked on its own regulations while its soldiers bled out in the mud. The Italian campaign was not a glorious march. It was a grind through a vertical cemetery. The smell of the Liri Valley in early 1944 was a sickening cocktail of wet wool, rotting vegetation, cordite, and the metallic tang of blood that never seemed to leave the soil. The fog was so thick it felt like wet cotton in your lungs. And out of that fog came the 222s. 222s were the German Wehrmacht's favorite tool for psychological and tactical terror. It was a 4-wheeled armored car, fast and nimble, armed with a 20mm autocannon that could shred a squad of men in seconds. It didn't fight battles, it mapped deaths. These cars would probe American lines at dawn and dusk, their engines whining like a disturbed hornet's nest. They would find a position, rake it with fire, and then vanish before a single American could aim a rifle. 12 hours later, the heavy artillery would fall exactly where the 222 had been. American doctrine said to use bazookas, but the 34th Division had 9 bazookas for thousands of men. They were told to use anti-tank rifles, but those had been phased out months ago. The result was a mounting list of names men Dalton had shared coffee and cigarettes with, now reduced to telegrams heading back to the States. The deaths weren't just statistics, they were ghosts that sat with Dalton in his foxhole. First, there was Private Eddie Kowalski, February 18th. A 222 rolled past his hole. Eddie, a machinist's son from Pittsburgh, fired his M1 Garand in a fit of desperate bravery. The rounds just sparked off the armor like pebbles. The 222's machine gun answered with a mechanical cough. Eddie was 20.
Then Sergeant Mike Brennan, February 23rd. He tried to hit a scout car with a grenade from 30 yards. He missed. The 20mm autocannon found him before he could drop back into the dirt. Brennan was the man who taught Dalton how to read terrain. Then came Louis Vargas, March 4th, caught in the open at dusk. The 222 didn't even stop. It just fired as it drove through the company's perimeter. By early March, 47 men were dead, not in a major offensive, but in daily, routine patrols. Dalton went to Captain Morrison. He stood in a barn that smelled of manure and gunpowder and laid out his plan. "Sir, the wheels, they move fast, but they're vulnerable. If we rig wire at axle height, we catch them at speed." Morrison's response was cold. "Corporal, the field manual does not authorize booby traps. Wire is for defensive perimeters. Stick to the protocol." Protocol was killing them. Innovation was the only way to survive. On the night of March 10th, after the deaths of Privates Chen and Harrison, Dalton decided that he was done waiting for the Army to give him permission to stay alive. He wasn't going to wait for a bazooka that was never coming. He was going to use the Gary rail yards logic. He was going to rig the system. He stepped out of his foxhole at midnight. No backup, no orders. If he was caught, he was a criminal. If he succeeded, he was a ghost. The mud of the Rapido River Valley was a living thing. It sucked at Dalton's boots with every step, a wet, rhythmic flup, flup that sounded like a heartbeat. He carried a coil of rusted barbed wire he'd scavenged from a supply dump and 2 entrenching shovels. The night was a deep velvet black, punctuated only by the distant rhythmic thunder of artillery to the north. He found the kill zone, a narrow stretch of dirt road between 2 ancient oak trees. The road was scarred with the tire tracks of the German patrols. Dalton knelt in the freezing slush. His hands were raw, the skin cracking from the cold and the biting rust of the wire. He drove the first shovel into the ground. Clang! The sound felt loud enough to wake every German sniper in the valley. He hammered it in with a rock, 12 inches deep, angle it back. Then the wire. He wrapped it around the handle, 3 loops, tight. He paced across the road, 18 feet. He drove the second shovel in. He stretched the wire. This was the critical part, the height, 14 inches. He had measured a destroyed 222 2 weeks ago. The axle sat at 13 to 15 inches. If the wire was too low, the car would roll over it. If it was too high, it would hit the hull and snap. He pulled the wire taut. He could feel the tension in his own shoulders. He plucked the wire, and it hummed a low metallic note that vibrated through his frozen fingers. He buried the wire under a half-inch of loose mud, just enough to hide the shine of the rust. The shovels looked like abandoned trash. It was a masterpiece of desperation. Dalton returned to his lines at 1:15 a.m. and didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his hole, staring into the gray mist. At 6:43 a.m., the sound arrived, a high-pitched whine, a German straight-six engine. The 222 emerged from the fog like a predatory shark in shallow water. 600 yards, 500 yards. The commander was visible, scanning the horizon with binoculars, looking for soldiers, for guns, for mines. He wasn't looking at the ground 4 inches in front of his wheels. 300 yards. Dalton's heart was a hammer against his ribs. 100 yards. The car accelerated. They wanted to clear the open stretch. 50 yards. 20 yards. Impact. The effect was not a scream of metal. It was a sudden, violent silence followed by a roar of physics. The wire caught the front right wheel. The axle seized instantly. At 15 miles per hour, the car had thousands of foot-pounds of momentum. The locked wheel became a pivot. The nose of the 222 dipped. The rear lifted, and the entire 4-ton machine went vertical. It flipped. Once, twice, 3 times. A shower of mud, glass, and gray paint. It landed upside down with a sound like a giant stepping on a tin can. Dalton was the first one to reach the wreck. He didn't feel triumph. He felt a cold, clinical relief. The commander was dead. His neck snapped like a dry twig. The gunner was unconscious, pinned under the turret. The driver, a boy no older than 22 with blonde hair matted with blood, crawled out through the shattered windscreen. He looked at Dalton and didn't reach for a Luger. He just raised his hands, trembling. He looked like a switchman from the Gary Yards who'd had a bad shift. Dalton looked at him, then at the wire. He reached down, unwrapped the wire from the axle, coiled it up, and shoved it into his pack. By the time Captain Morrison arrived 6 minutes later, the evidence was gone. "What happened, Corporal?" Morrison asked, staring at the smoking, inverted wreck. "It flipped, sir. Must have hit a crater," Dalton replied, his face a mask of granite. Morrison knew he was lying. You don't flip a 4-ton car on a flat road. But the German was a prisoner. The threat was neutralized, and for the first time in weeks, nobody in the company was dead. He let it go. The Army is a place of official orders, but it is also a place of whispered secrets. By that afternoon, every private in the company knew. They didn't need a manual. They needed 2 shovels and 30 feet of wire.
Private Morrison approached Dalton. "Teach me." That night they rigged another. Then Jackson did it. Then O'Malley. Then Williams. The Dalton Method spread like a virus through the 34th Division. It was a silent rebellion against a military bureaucracy that had failed them. By March 25th, German reconnaissance in the sector had dropped by 60%. The Germans were terrified. They didn't know what was happening. Their cars were flipping, crashing, and disappearing. Lieutenant Richter of the 29th Panzer Grenadiers began to investigate. He crawled under a wreck and found a single microscopic fragment of rusted wire embedded in a wheel housing. He reported it to his superiors. They didn't believe him. "Wire can't stop a tank," they said. "It's not stopping a tank," Richter argued. "It's stopping a wheel. It's using our own speed against us." On April 3rd, Captain Morrison caught Private Williams red-handed. 2 shovels, axle height. Williams froze. He expected a court-martial. Morrison didn't shout. He walked over, tested the tension of the wire with his boot, and took out a notebook. "Who taught you this?" "Corporal Dalton, sir." Morrison looked at the empty road. He looked at the casualty reports. In February, they lost 47 men. In March, they lost 12. In the first 3 days of April, they had lost 0. "Show me the placement for different terrain," Morrison ordered. "I want to know the exact tension required for a half-track versus a scout car." He wasn't stopping it. He was documenting it. He wrote a 3-page report to battalion. They rejected it instantly. Unauthorized. Discontinue. Morrison did what any good officer does when a regulation is wrong. He filed the rejection in the trash and told his men to keep digging. By May 1944, the 34th Division was the safest sector in Italy for reconnaissance attacks. The German 222s were moving at a crawl, their commanders dismounting to check every inch of the road. Their effectiveness was destroyed. When the division was pulled back to Naples for rest, Dalton was summoned to a tent at division headquarters. He expected the worst. Instead, he met Colonel Anderson, the intelligence officer. "Corporal, I've seen the numbers. I can't officially approve this. If I do, the engineering corps will have my head for bypassing safety standards. But I'm assigning you to a special training detail. You're going to teach the incoming 36th Division how to improvise obstacles." For 2 weeks, the switchman from Indiana taught 60 soldiers how to destroy German armor with trash. He didn't use a blackboard. He used the mud. He taught them about tension, about the singing note of the wire,
and about the psychological impact of a car that flips for no apparent reason. Between March and August 1944, Dalton's method disabled an estimated 43 vehicles. Hundreds of artillery strikes were never called in. Hundreds of American boys who should have died in the Leary Valley went home to marry their sweethearts and work in their local mills. The official record credited enhanced defensive awareness. Dalton's name was never mentioned.
James Dalton was discharged in November 1945. He didn't have a Medal of Honor. He didn't have a Bronze Star for his innovation. He had a CIB and a rank of sergeant. He went back to Gary, Indiana. He walked back into the same rail yards he'd left 3 years prior. He married Dorothy. He had 3 children. He worked for U.S. Steel for 41 years. To his neighbors, he was just Jim, the guy who was good with his hands and didn't talk much about the war. Every year on March 12th, the phone would ring. It was Morrison, or Williams, or Jackson. They would talk for 5 minutes about the cold, the mud, and the wire. They would remember Chen and Brennan. Then they would hang up and go back to their lives. Dalton died in 1987. He never asked for credit. He never wrote a book. He didn't need to. He knew that in the darkest hour of the 34th Division, he had seen a system failure and fixed it with the only thing he had.
The Dalton Method didn't die with him. In 1949, the U.S. Army officially integrated axle-height wire obstacles into its training manuals. They credited field observations from the Italian campaign. They still teach it today. Modern special forces use variations of the Dalton trap to stop insurgent vehicles in desert environments. But there's a final secret. In the 1960s, a German historian found Lieutenant Richter's original report. It turns out the Germans had begun developing a wire-cutting attachment for the front of their cars specifically because of Dalton. If the war had lasted 6 more months, the wire war would have escalated into a technological arms race, all started by a corporal with 2 shovels. The simplest solutions are often the most dangerous, and the greatest heroes are often the ones who never tell a soul. Thank you for watching.